would like to welcome Matt Clancy, who generously agreed to be our first speaker in this meta science cycle. And the way that I found out about Matt is I just discovered this newsletter called New Things Under the Sun. It's basically a living literature review. Matt reviews different topics related to innovation, does it very thoroughly. And what's really great is he keeps updating the links so the information is always current. My understanding is that he does this through his position as a research fellow at Open Philanthropy. He does come from a scientific background. He actually did a PhD in economics from Iowa State University. And he's also previously been an employee of the Institute for Progress. Now he's working with Open Philanthropy since November 2022. He was also a recipient of a grant from Emergent Ventures. This is the Tyler Cowen think tank associated with the Mercatus Center. And they have also provided some of the funding for the work he does. So, Matt, that's what I know about you. Feel free to add other things that might be interesting. And
Sure.
then, when you're ready, we can start with the official part of your presentation.
Thanks very much. Excited to be here. By training, I'm an economist specializing in economics of innovation and science. I work at Open Philanthropy, and I spend about a third of my time writing this living literature review. I also do research for Open Philanthropy, and I run their innovation policy grant-making program. So we are trying to take the lessons of meta science and figure out who we can give grants to sort of make science and technology more efficient and so forth, and try to iron out some of the bugs. And I'll sort of highlight one potential set of problems with the way we sort of organize science now in my talk. But yeah, that's it. And I'm going to plan to talk about the. Go ahead.
Maybe we can just kind of, chat a little bit about your background. I'm curious how you went from academia to philanthropy. Looks like it's been a 10-year evolution, but how did that come about?
Yeah, so I was on a very normal trajectory at first. I was a research economist out of PhD for the US government, working for the Department of Agriculture on science policy. And then I joined Iowa State University, where I was an assistant teaching professor, teaching on these topics, doing research, presenting at conferences and so forth. And basically, I started this newsletter that you alluded to, and I just discovered that I really liked doing it. And during COVID, I couldn't do it anymore because I had to take care of my kids, and I had to move my classes online. So I was out of time to do this sort of extra project, and I really missed it. So when I had capacity to do it again, I applied for this grant from Emergent Ventures that you alluded to, and they gave me a grant. I reduced my teaching load a little bit so that I could actually work on this thing professionally, and it just sort of took over my life. It became the main thing I worked on for a while, and that's Open Philanthropy was reading it. They gave me another grant to work on it, and then they just sort of said, why don't you actually come run our innovation policy program, because it's about a lot of the things that you're writing about anyway. So and the literature review was kind of always about trying to put academic work on the economics of innovation and science and sort of social science research related to innovation and science to try to make that more useful and accessible, I think, to kind of the broader public and to people who are not just in that field studying those issues. And so that was something that was really appealing to me as sort of a next step in that evolution.
Cool. And where are you located right now?
I work from my home in Iowa. I was at Iowa State University before, and so I work remotely. Open Philanthropy is based in San Francisco.
Cool. And are you full-time with Open Philanthropy?
I am now, yeah.
So any chance of going back to academia, or that's on hold for now?
It's not my plan for the moment. No. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think for all of us in research, and especially for those starting research, it's encouraging to know that, there are careers outside of academia. And I imagine that some of the students have questions about that. Basically, students are encouraged to ask questions, and we'll see how this goes. Feel free to start talking. Are you okay with us interrupting if there's something that we want to expand on?
Yeah,
excellent.
That sounds good.
And basically, Matt will be with us for about 45 minutes. Is that the plan? That's what you're shooting for?
I think you have a 3-hour class, but it doesn't always go the full 3 hours.
No, not at all. No.
Okay.
So basically, I said, talk about 30 to 60 minutes, your call. So, whatever you have planned. And then I would like to have some time for discussion based on what you will cover. So
Yep.
I say we just get going, and we'll see how everything evolves.
Sounds good. I'm shooting for roughly 45 minutes to talk and then take questions. All
Perfect.
right.
Great.
So I do have slides. I'm going to share them with you. Economics of science funding. And the basic agenda, I want to talk about, some basic facts to get out of the way, like, well, who even pays for science at a really broad level? Then we're going to go into some classic sort of economics questions, why science tends to be publicly funded. Most stuff in the economy is funded by, banks and private equity, and I don't know, think the private sector trying to sort of make money. Why is science different? And then the third thing I'll talk about is basically that, it tends to be funded by government and other nonprofits, universities, and they have systems for trying to figure out what science to fund. And we'll talk a little bit about how well that system works, specifically peer review and kind of an evidence for and against, like evidence that peer review works in some settings and has some problems in other settings. The way that I'm planning to structure this talk is basically, I'll give you kind of these big picture like themes, and then I'll sort of try to support them with evidence from some papers, because that's kind of what I do, is read papers and try to synthesize them. And so each slide is basically just a chart that will make no sense until I explain what you're seeing, but it will hopefully build up to providing evidence for these kind of claims I'm making. So, but first we're going to just start with some basic facts about who's paying for science. And this is just a standard chart from the National Science Foundation, the amount who's paying for R&D. So we're not really at science yet. We're at anything considered research and development. And you can see the US and China are in the world, the two biggest, but France, United Kingdom, Germany's in here, but they don't have data that I need for the next slide. Anyway, you add up the EU, and they're also a big line too, but because it's split among lots of countries, they look smaller than that. So R&D includes lots of things that we wouldn't consider science. In fact, mostly things that we wouldn't consider basic science. So if you want to zoom into basic science, I added some lines to this chart, and the science spending is on the right-hand side, and it's these darker bars. And you can see that the US, most countries spend about like 14-15% as much on science, which or basic research is sort of the thing I'm using as a proxy for science, as they do on sort of total R&D. So you can see here on the right-hand side, the US spends, like $700 billion on R&D, maybe a little over $100 billion on sort of basic science. China's a bit of an outlier in that they spend a lot less on basic science relative to how much they spend on R&D, and so on. So this is your first step. And then within the United States, who's actually paying for science, so basic research? And you don't really, like, I didn't put the numbers on here because they're not that important. The main thing is you can see business is kind of roughly, say, a third. And then the rest of this pie chart is things like the US government, state governments, higher education, nonprofits. And this is sort of emphasizing this point I made that, the public sector tends to pay for basic science. If you look at the rest of R&D, so if you take the starting figure, strip out the science spending, and take what's left over, the figure looks more like this, where business is paying for, the vast majority of it. And the federal government still pays for a lot. A lot of that's like Department of Defense. This is all US data, which is what I'm most familiar with. Yeah, we got a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Yes, for the non-economist, could you remind us what those triple P are on the y-axis of the previous?
Sorry, yeah. So this is called purchasing power parity. It's not that essential. Basically, it's trying to adjust the currency so that it's comparable across countries. So the idea is, in some countries, a scientist wage might be a lot lower than in the United States, but they're doing comparable work. And so this tries to adjust for that. So it's like,
So
how
it's
much
comparable.
actual science are you buying? Yeah, to make it comparable.
Thanks.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm just trying to give you some big picture stuff here that, a little bit of a flavor of who's paying for this stuff. I should say also, like, most countries spend a couple percent of GDP on R&D, and then, something like 14% of that is on basic science. So this is the high level thing about just sort of establishing the fact that the US, or not the US, but just the public sector in general, tends to be the one that pays for science. It's not a private sector enterprise in general, although there is a role for it. And so a classic question in economics is like, well, why is that the case? Why can't we have, it seems natural to think like there's something wrong with the idea that private sector business would be the main funders of science, but what can we articulate why that doesn't seem to work? And there's a couple reasons, and we'll start with the first is that science tends to take a long time to pay off. So if you're just trying to make money off science, like it's not that profitable because the lag between when you discover some new principle about how the world works and how when you translate that into a new technology that you can go sell is a long lag. So as one piece of evidence, here's a patent. This is for a patent for a new kind of plant that has like genetic resistance and stuff. So it's kind of a science-based technology. And we can use this to sort of infer a little bit about what was the gap between when scientific discoveries were made and when this patent was made. And I'll show you a couple different lines of evidence, because I think one thing with social science is that we never have like we rarely have like some decisive piece of evidence where like this establishes the case once and for all. Everything has like caveats and carve outs and so on. So you got to look at a lot of different things and sort of piece it together is my view. But anyway, this is our starting point. Here's a patent. We can see here that this patent was filed in the year 2008, which tells us that's sort of when, that's the closest signal we have of when these guys did the R&D. And then we have in the other right-hand side, these are some of the academic papers that were cited in this patent, and we can see the years that those papers were published, okay? So then we can just say, well, what's the gap, all right? So the first paper was from 1995, and this patent was filed in 2008, so there's 13 years difference there. And then if you look across them, we got a 17-year gap, a 3-year gap, and an 8-year gap. On average, 10.25 years. Although we don't know, which of these papers is like most important, we just know they got cited. So if you kind of do this at scale for all patents, about 29% of patents in the US, this would have been in like 2019, cite some kind of scientific literature. And if you just look at the average gap between when the patent gets filed and when the paper they're citing was published, it's like a gap of 17 years. So this is like our first piece of evidence that there's something on the order of like over a decade, maybe closer to 2 decades between when discoveries get made and when somebody's able to sort of start making money off them. Here's another paper that did the same kind of thing, but
Matt, sorry, a question here. I noticed 2008 as the day the patent was filed, but then it's actually 2017 when the patent was issued. So how does that play? Like that's additional 9 years.
Yeah. So that's another reason or rationale for delay is when you file a patent is when it begins the process of being reviewed by the patent office. This patent took an unusually long time between when it was filed and when it was granted. Normally the average is more like 3 years. So I just grabbed this one because it was an example I had close to hand. I don't mean to infer too much from that, but it is, we'll see in a minute here, a different line of evidence that tries to get away from that problem of like, there's a gap between when you file a patent and when you maybe are starting to get money that's rolling in if you're a private company trying to make money off science. This is another paper. This is a chart from another paper that's trying to do something similar. On the vertical axis, but I guess what this paper has done that's a little different is each of these dots is like a different technology or a different science field. So on the left, we have different fields of science, and on the right, we have different technology fields in the patent system. And on the vertical axis, we're saying, on average, what's the shortest gap between a paper they cite and when the patent was filed. Okay, and so we can see there's some variation, like this nanoscience and nanotech, they tend to be, if they're citing a paper, it's like the closest one tends to be like 2 years old, 2 years from behind when they cite it. So they're staying really close to the cutting edge. Mathematics, it's more like a 12-year gap. Like if a mathematics paper gets cited by a patent, it tends to be like 12 years after it was published. On the horizontal axis, we have a different way of trying to get at this question, which is like, sometimes the link between science and technology is a lot more indirect. It's not that I'm like reading a paper and then like doing the first thing on it. It might be that somebody reads the paper, invents some cool new thing, like maybe they invent a new computer chip, and then I use that computer chip to do something else, and I don't even know about the underlying science that was going on there. And so what this paper is trying to do is get at that by looking at sequences of citation. So maybe a patent doesn't cite a paper, but maybe it cites another patent, and that patent cites a paper. So it's kind of like a 1 degree removed from the scientific frontier. And on the horizontal axis, they're basically saying, well, what's the shortest time on average till we get connected to technology through one of these chains, right? So on average, if a math paper gets directly cited, it's 12 years. If it is sort of, but that's not normal. Normally, math papers are not directly cited by patents, but they might be cited by papers that are cited by papers that are cited by patents that are, and in that case, the gap tends to be closer to like 20 years between when the paper gets written and when somebody is finally starting to sort of make use potentially of those ideas. Nicola, do you have an idea or a comment?
So actually, I had a comment for something previously because we have questions on the Slido board, and I wanted to ask it now because it might not make sense afterwards. So this is a question from Nika, and again, students should feel free, everybody should feel free to just raise a hand and ask the question. The question is, the chart on spending money on R&D, does it include companies? Yeah. So basically, what do you mean by R&D if it's not pure science? Maybe you can make that distinction.
Yeah. So the R&D companies definitely include businesses, and in fact, it's mostly businesses. And it would be like Apple inventing a new iPhone, doing the engineering maybe to figure that out. It could even be like, Quaker Oats coming up with a new brand of Cheerios that they classify as research and testing and so forth. Okay, so it's not necessarily like the kind of way we think about it is, are you trying to leverage existing knowledge and to sort of solve a problem, or are you trying to learn new things about how the world works? Is sort of how we think about science, and it's not necessarily directed specifically at solving some specific problem. I wanted to, if that's okay, I'll move on to a different line of evidence about this science taking a long time. So the other way you can do this is forget patents. There's all sorts of weird issues with patents that, not everything gets patented. Sometimes you keep stuff secret. Sometimes patents are junk. Not everything uses science. Maybe the most important patents are different than the average patent and so forth. So a different way that people have tried to tackle this problem is they've said, well, let's just sort of let's use statistics. And this is a paper from agriculture, where in agriculture, we can measure pretty precisely the productivity of farms because we can measure their yields. We can see how much land they have. We can see how much fertilizer they're using. And we can sort of say, how productive are these farms? And then they basically look at trends over time of the productivity of agriculture. This is again in the US. And they compare that to trends in agricultural R&D spending, so spending on R&D. And they basically are kind of looking for like, all right, there was maybe a surge of R&D spending in 1970 in Iowa. What happened to farm productivity in Iowa 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later? Is there a connection between those two things? And they use sort of this Bayesian approach. And long story short, they sort of find like the model's best fit, this is this red line when they use these statistics, around like a 20-year gap between when the R&D is done and when you start to see matching signals to some degree out there in agricultural fields. There's another paper that tried to do this for sort of the entire US economy. It's an old paper. I won't say that much about it, but this is their data on basically the number of scientific papers published going back to 1908 up through 1982. They do kind of a similar exercise where they try to say like, they're kind of clever. They're like, all right, we have this one industry, say it's textiles, and we can see what kinds of scientists the textile industry hires. Maybe they hire a lot of chemists. And then so we think that tells us they care about chemistry, and they look at how the productivity of this industry is related to how many chemistry articles come out. And they do this for lots of industries and so on. Again, they find that their model fits best around like a gap of 20 years between these things. So we've got sort of, I think this is kind of a nice convergence of two lines of evidence. We've got this patent data, and we've got this R&D data. There's another line of evidence that I don't have any slides about, which is more looking at biomedical data specifically, and like trying to sort of more qualitatively look at new drugs that get patented or that get approved, and then what scientific discoveries they relied on. That also finds something on the order of decades, although that tends to be a little longer, I think, because you have to do the clinical trials, and that takes longer too. Anyway, long story short, why do scientists not work more on, or why don't businesses necessarily invest more in science? Well, the investments take too long to pay off, maybe. A second reason is because you do science, you learn something about how the world works, and it's really uncertain what the application is going to be. Like, are you going to really be able to use it if you're a company? Here's one example. This is a paper that I wrote back when I was at Iowa State University. We'll just focus on this gray line in the middle. There's a lot of data here. This is looking again at patents, and it's looking at those citations they make to journals. And this is basically saying, like, we've got 6 different kinds of patents. They're all related to agriculture. And we're looking, do they cite, what share of the citations they make are to sort of agricultural science journals? Okay. And for most of these fields, it's well under half. Okay. Plants is the one exception, but they're mostly not citing agricultural science journals. They're mostly citing things like chemistry or biology. And this is just meant to sort of provide an indication that people are drawing ideas from people who from disparate realms that are not necessarily like focused on trying to solve agricultural problems. Here's another one that's related to biomedicine. This is about grants made for scientific research at the National Institute for Health, which is the biggest funder of biomedical research in the US and probably in the world. And this paper tried to sort of say, like, all right, if you make a grant for research for cancer research, what's the probability that there's going to be some new drug down the line that's going to draw on the research you funded? And they sort of try to assess that by saying, all right, this grant paid for some research that resulted in journal articles. Those journal articles cite the grant. And then we look to see if patents again cite those journal articles. And there's 2 lines here that are kind of important. There's this black line and there's this dashed line. There's a couple other lines, but we're mostly interested in these 2. This is the probability a couple of years later that you get cited by a patent that's working on the disease for which this NIH grant was made versus a different disease. And you can see that the dashed line is like a little bit higher, although it's similar. Again, this is basically saying you fund for some disease, the probability that you get cited by some patent for medicine down the road is about equal that it's going to be for the disease the research was funded for versus some other disease. Okay, so again, it's just hard to predict what you're going to be able to use scientific discoveries for. And there's lots of anecdotal examples, but they're not cherry-picked examples, I guess, is the lesson. Like, you can think of examples of like unexpected applications, and if you look for them in like broader scale statistics, you sort of find that story is sort of true. So that's another reason that if you're a company, science isn't that appealing. You don't know if it's going to be useful for your particular product. Last idea.
Thank you, Matt.
Is
there's a Moritz.
Go ahead.
Just a second. So I see a question. Moritz, do you want to ask it, or should I just read it out? Unless you speak in 1 second, I'll say it. So he wants to know, how do you see the 20 years gap in the agriculture slide? What shows that it's 20?
So this is I didn't explain very well what this chart was showing. What this red line is supposed to tell us is basically the distribution of the impact. So there'll be some impact from a year of R&D, and basically, 100% of the impact will happen between now and year 50 is what this thing is saying. Essentially 0% of that impact will happen in the first couple of years, and then it starts to get, we get like some share of the impact. Like, I don't know, maybe this is, I can't do it off the top of my head. Some small number of like impact, and that means that we're starting to see like productivity tip up a little bit on average. But the the largest set of impact is around year 20. That's what this chart is trying to show us. And you can see though that 20 is like an average, is like kind of a modal average. There's actually like impact runs for a long time and a lot less. So there's some ideas that happen quickly. There's some ideas that take a very long time to have their impact, but on average, like 20 years is sort of a reasonable first order approximation. So the last thing is like a reason that firms maybe don't invest in so much in science is because it's hard to protect scientific discoveries from your competition. They can kind of free ride on your work. My slide to sort of show this is a chart of when private companies publish scientific papers, which does happen sometimes. It's not, I say, like we saw in our original chart, it's like a third of the spending on science is still done by private companies. The blue line is how often they cite their publications in their own patents, and the gray line is how often rivals cite their scientific publications in their patents. And so basically you're publishing stuff and your rivals are the ones who are sort of building on the knowledge. And that's another historical reason why firms would underinvest in R&D. So the summary so far of this presentation, private sector role in funding science is small relative to sort of the rest of R&D. And there's kind of three classical reasons that seem like they're pretty well supported, I think, in the data we have. It takes a long time for a firm that's sort of on a shorter time horizon, or if it wants to use patents to protect its ideas. A patent is a finite life. Patent actually expires after 20 years. So even if you could instantly even if you could patent scientific ideas, which you can't, by the time you're able to sort of spin out a technology, your patent is almost up. Second is the scientific ideas may not be applicable to your particular line of work. And third, it's very hard to sort of keep that knowledge away from other people. It can't be patented. It has broad applications often. And so a lot of the benefits flow to other people, and maybe they can even kind of use the ideas to directly compete against you, and kind of you did the work for them, and they get the applications and can maybe even put price pressure on your technologies that you develop based on these technologies. So these are the reasons it's less common. Doesn't mean it never happens, because there's still value to learning how the world works. It enables you to do new things. And so sometimes companies do find it worth investing in that stuff. So let's focus, though, on the public sector and think a little bit about how they choose what science to fund, because it's a problem. We have finite budgets. We can't just fund every cool idea. How do we pick the ones that we're going to fund? And there's a variety of approaches, but most of them rely to some degree on peer review, which is a system where you get experts basically in the field to rate the proposal, and then you usually have a couple people, you sort of average their results, or you get them to consult with each other in a panel, and they come up with some kind of recommendation, and that's basically an input in the decision making. Sometimes it's the main input, so they just sort of take the peer review scores, they rank them, and then they just fund until they fund them until they run out of money. Other times there's some kind of person who's got discretion. They use them as an input, but they can maybe move them around a little bit based on their own choices. So we use the system. Do we know if it works? So I think the answer is there is signal in those peer review scores. It's very hard to predict what kind of scientific projects are going to succeed and fail, but peer review provides some positive signal. So this is a study from Lee and Aga. It's looking at over 100,000 grants made by the National Institutes for Health. And they've got the peer review scores for all of these research proposals. We're only going to look at proposals that get funded, because proposals that don't get funded, we don't know what happens to them. And, obviously, they may not perform good science because they didn't get any money to do the experiments. But if we look within the realm of the ones that get funded, we can rank them from number one. So these ones over here on 0 are the highest ranked. They got the best peer review score, all the way down to 100. And you can see there's not many things that get in that 100, because the NIH is almost never going to fund something that was last voted among its list. And then there are a bunch of different ways you can try to assess, did peer review work? You can look at how well cited were the publications that got published. And you can see there's kind of there's a downward slope basically, but it's very noisy, right? So the best rated ones tend to get more citations than the 50th percentile. But you can see here at the 50th percentile, there is still the odd paper or the odd research project that did just as well as a top cited one. You can look at how many papers they publish. Similar kind of thing. This paper does a lot of other stuff too. It looks at, how much do they result in patents? How much do they result in, they try to control for other things like what field you are, how prestigious the professor is, and just look at how much extra predictive power the peer review score is, and so on. And anyway, this is our first piece of evidence. A bunch of other people have looked at similar evidence. And if you have a large sample, I think you find similar kinds of results. If you have a very small sample, things are so noisy that sometimes you don't get that there's a relationship. Here's another interesting project that looked at a similar idea. This took advantage of the fact that in the 2008 financial crisis in the US, there was this large stimulus package passed, the America Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It was like $800 billion. Part of that $800 billion went to the NIH, and I think they got like $1.7 billion in extra unexpected sort of research funding. So basically the NIH unexpectedly got more money and was able to fund more projects than it normally would have. And so what this paper does is it says, all right, let's look at the set of projects that were funded under the kind of normal budget. This is the funded in normal time stuff. And let's compare it to the stuff that was funded only because there was this financial crisis. And so they basically went down the peer review list and published addition and basically picked other papers to get funding that wouldn't normally have gotten funding. And so this tells us basically like if these research proposals do just about as well as the ones we normally fund, that says we're not doing a very good job picking winners, okay? So what's the result? The ones that are funded under kind of the normal budget got a little bit more publications and a little bit more citations than the ones that would normally not have been funded because they didn't get high enough scores and were not voted high enough by the program officers. But because of this financial crisis, there was extra money and they did get funded. So again, like I say, peer review sort of works because these are not huge stellar differences. One last one is this paper Claverie et al. From 2000. And this looked at the Spanish health research funds or Spanish health research projects. They had about 3,000 projects that they were evaluating. This chart here, the thing that's kind of unsatisfying about this paper is that they just have really coarse evidence. They have like the recommendations of two different kind of peer review committees. Was it highly recommended or not highly recommended? And then we have a chart here about did they publish projects or did they publish any papers? And we can see that if everybody thinks highly recommended it, they published papers more likely. If only one person highly recommended it, it's lower. And if neither was highly recommended, it's lower still. But actually, I think the most interesting thing about this study is something that didn't have a chart. So there's not a chart for it here. But they also asked the scientists they asked a bunch of reviewers to go back and just look at these proposals and rank them from 0 to 10 on like their scientific merit. So sometimes we worry that citations, publications, patents, this is all like not the right thing to be looking at. We actually like what's good science is more subjective and could be misleading. So this is a paper that they actually had like human beings read the reports from these grants and look over their literature and score them, like how good was the science that came out of this. And you get basically the same kind of result, but it's again really small. It's like out of 10 points, if everybody, if somebody liked it, they gave it a high score, it goes up like between 0.3 or 0.7 out of 10 on these rating scales that are like after the fact, after the research is done, and we can kind of evaluate how well it worked.
So just to clarify, all of these
yeah.
peer reviews are related to grant peer reviews, not to publication peer reviews. Is that correct?
That's right. Because so I'm focused, there is a literature on that too. It has kind of similar results about, it's like a noisy predictor of what happens to these papers. But I'm focusing on the grant stuff because I'm doing economics of science funding today. So yeah, so this tells us peer review, it's predicting something. It actually doesn't tell us like anything about if it's like cost effective, because we are using people's time and resources, and we don't know if like the value we get from having 5 peer reviewers is enough to justify relative to 1 and all the paper, who knows? But it is at least telling us something that's like good to know that it's not just total nothing, which is sometimes alleged. And sometimes the data is noisy enough that I think if you have a small sample, 100 papers instead of 100,000, you may actually just find like peer review doesn't seem to do anything.
And just as heads up, we will have Adam Mastroianni in 2 weeks to argue that aspect of peer review. So it's a very interesting point.
And now we'll talk. So now we'll talk though about. I'm going to kind of anticipate some of those things maybe, and talk a little about some problems with peer review. All right. So one of the problems is the peers are experts in this field, and if they are basically this kind of biases, this imposes a slight penalty on projects for which it is difficult to find expert peer reviewers, okay? So this is a very clever paper that looks again at the NIH, and it looks at the probability that you get funded. And the way they kind of assess whether the peer review committee has expertise in your field is they look to see if the senior member of the committee has cited your research before. That's kind of a signal that they're kind of familiar with the work you do. And the problem is like, well, if you've been cited before, you know, maybe that just means that you were a good scientist. You published work that people liked and they wanted to cite it. And so we can't just rely on that. The thing that's kind of neat about this paper is like in the NIH, it's so hard to get a grant that people often have done like a lot of the research ahead of time and have some kind of papers that are like almost ready to be published. And so what this paper does is it's like after you submit the grant, it looks for like similar papers that are published within, I think maybe it's after you get the grant, but it looks for basically papers that get published within like before you receive the money or really short time period, so that it's very unlikely that the grant enabled you to do research that then you published a thing on, but it's still similar to what you propose. They're basically trying to say, let's look at the papers that are basically done and submitted as part of the application. And then let's see how well cited those papers are, because that can tell us like how good the underlying science was by sort of, I guess, the scientific community. And that's what's on the horizontal axis here. And the key difference here is the red line is what's the probability you get a grant if people have cited your work? And the blue line is what's the probability you get cited if people have not previously cited your work? And out here on the right-hand side, these are grants that we think they're really good grants. Like the papers that were associated with them got really highly cited. If the peer reviewers are familiar with your work, those papers are more likely to be, get funding from the NIH. If they're unfamiliar with your work, it doesn't really help you very much that your proposal is actually very good compared to if we go all the way to the left-hand side, these are papers that didn't really ever get cited. And so the issue is, reviewers, maybe it's hard for reviewers to give a very strong endorsement of a field that they're just not that confident in. They're not that, they don't know the field that well. And so then you can never really get above like a pretty good score if you're doing something that's very different and weird and unrelated to what the peer reviewers are working on. And then this shows that, if we're kind of taking the best rankings, the perfect scores, and we don't often get to the pretty good scores, you may have trouble getting funded. That's one potential issue. Another is, I call this like the random average problem. So I don't have a good chart for this, but this is, based on some actual data from the European Social Research Council stuff. So we got peer reviewers, they're scoring papers from 1 to 6. 6 is the best. And in this particular grant system, about a quarter of papers get a perfect 6 from a peer reviewer. And also this paper, because they've got data on all the peer review reports, they know that there's actually very low correlation among reviewers. This again gets to the fact that peer review is pretty noisy. That means that like, just because you get a 6 out of 6 from one reviewer, it's not that much more likely you're going to get a 6 out of 6 from a second reviewer. Okay, it's a little bit correlated, but people have pretty independent draws. Okay, let's suppose that funding is tight, so perfect scores are like very likely to be funded, which is actually true also. They're much more likely to be funded. Suppose you have a weird paper that's interdisciplinary, it doesn't fit neatly into things, and the reviewing committee has some discretion about how many peer review reports they send out for in this example, or in this, and it's actually the case in the European Social Research Council, apparently, according to this paper. Like if it's like right down the middle, like a conventional field, maybe you get 2 reviewers. And if it's a weird proposal that's like interdisciplinary and crosses multiple boundaries, maybe you need more reviewers because you want to get more people talking about the different parts. Well, just as like a fact of statistics, as you add more peer reviewers, like the probability that all of them give you a 6 out of 6 falls. Okay, if each one has a 25% chance of giving you a 6 out of 6, then if there's 2 reviewers, the chance that both give you a 6 out of 6 is about 6%. If you have to get 4 reviewers, the average, the probability they all give you perfect 6 out of 6 is really small. It's like a 10th the size. And so this can be like another minor penalty. Whereas if you get more reviewers, on average, you're going to get a result that's closer to the average than basically people who have small numbers are going to be like out in the tails more. And that means they'll be disproportionately represented in the upper tail too. A final kind of potential issue is about this kind of asymmetric bias when people are sharing information. So this is a paper that did an experiment on peer reviewers where people reviewed papers. They scored them, I think, 1 out of 9. And then the experiment was right before you submit your review, they say, by the way, the other peer reviewers gave this score on average. So they tell you what the other peer reviewers thought. Now, it was an experiment, and in fact, they were like manipulating things. They were not. They randomly told people that, you know, your other peer reviewers gave a higher score than you, or they gave you a lower score. They agreed with you, and then they give you the chance to reevaluate and go back and like decide if you want to change your answers. And so, basically, this chart is trying to show us how people respond to that information. If you get the red, that's basically saying the peer reviewers agreed with you. Well, people don't really change their answer. Kind of makes sense. The blue line is telling us what happens if people gave a higher score than you. People tend to go back and they actually start to be like, well, actually, I think the report is a little stronger than maybe I thought. And then they revise up, like a half point out of 9. And the black is what happens if you're told the reviewers had a lower score than you. And people respond, they revise downwardly, but they revise downwardly more severely than they revise upward. And so basically, if people tell you that, like, I found a big problem in this paper, people are pretty responsive. And if people tell you like, you know, this paper was great, I really liked it, people respond a bit, but not as much. Now, these effects are not big, they're not huge. But I think it's just interesting that like peer review is super noisy. So even in the best of times, like you might just get a bad luck and just not get a really good idea funded. Plus, quality seems to be a bit harder to detect if the reviewers are unfamiliar with your field and if it's harder to find people like that. Plus, if you need more reviewers, this just statistics is going to say like it's going to get harder for you to get like an absolute top score. Like fourth, if these panels are exchanging ideas, which an important piece of information is a lot of peer review panels do have a session where the panel comes together and meets and they discuss the papers. And so this experiment is not meaningless, right? Like it's not normally like when I do a peer review report for a journal, I don't see what the other peer reviewers say until after I've submitted. But in a lot of these grant viewing sessions, like we would meet as a panel and then we would all discuss the paper. And so I would essentially learn what other people think. And in those cases, it seems like people are more responsive to negative news than positive news, which means if you consider two research proposals that have the same average score, but one of them has variance, some people love it, some people don't like it, people are going to update that one more downward compared to one that's just sort of like 8 out of 8 from everybody. Okay. Whereas if one is like 9 out of, not 8 out of 10. Suppose it's like, one is 8 out of 10 by everybody and one is 10 out of 10 from some people and 6 out of 10 from other people, and it averages 8 out of 8. The second one is going to be penalized by this thing. Anyway, it all adds up to potentially a frustrating peer review experience for ideas that are kind of more unusual, riskier, weirder. And that is the kind of thing that a lot of people complain about in the peer review system. So this is my second to last slide. So we're wrapping up here. So what are the alternatives, right? It seems like peer review just makes sense. You ask experts what they think. You ask a couple of, like, what else can you do? Well, there's a bunch of different proposals. And Stuart will talk about some potential ideas too. One is, rather than focusing on individual projects, you focus on picking the right people. This is what like the Howard Hughes Medical Institute does. They identify individuals who they think are great scientists, and they just basically give them a bunch of money and a lot of discretion to pick whatever kind of projects they want to do. And they give them a long time horizon. A second is, rather than peer review, you could rely on individuals who make their own decisions about what kind of programs to, and they would be experts themselves. The DARPA and ARPA type projects rely on something like this, where they have empowered program officers who pick a bunch of different grants. They actually do solicit expert advice, but there's a paper that shows that they don't listen to the peer review averages as much as they listen to things like what is the best score for this, what does the best peer review report say about this potential idea, and they're more responsive to things like that. And they can also do things like, because they're one person in charge of a whole portfolio, they might say, yeah, this project scored lower, but it's doing something very different than all the other ones. And so rather than doing two things that are kind of the same, I'll do one from this pool and a second that's very different, and then the chances that at least one of those approaches works out is maybe higher. A third approach that people have talked about is called golden tickets, or and essentially the idea is it's peer review, but the peer reviewers are allocated a small number of like golden tickets, which basically they can apply and say, I really believe in this idea and I want it to go through. And that means it kind of overrides what the other peer reviewers might say. Another idea is just use lotteries. Maybe have peer review to throw out the garbage, and maybe have peer review if there's like to identify the top proposals, but there's a large group in the middle that maybe we think peer review is not going to be very sensitive to, and we think there's these biases, and plus it takes a lot of people's time, and not just to review it, but to do the application. So maybe we should literally just randomize once we establish that it meets some certain criteria. And so we just hold a lottery, and maybe that's the way. And then the final approach that people have talked about is a very decentralized research approach where scientists are given budgets and basically can use their budgets to fund other scientists' research. And the idea is that they're in the mix, they're sort of observing what's happening, and they can make these kind of subjective judgments. This has not been done at scale where like a whole country gives its budget to the scientists to decide how to spend. But there are small programs that have done things like this, where they have kind of scouts who are out in the field who are practicing scientists, and they also have a budget for making grants, and they can basically, when they identify people they think are very good or projects they think are very good, they can basically give that person a grant. So we do have alternatives. We don't know very much about how well they work. And I think Stuart will talk a little bit more about those ideas. And yeah, this is all stuff. This report is kind of drawn from a bunch of articles I wrote on this Living Literature Review that Nicola mentioned at the beginning. And there's probably some way we can share the slides, but anyway, those are the articles. So that's what I got.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Matt. Excellent. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the overview. And we had an evacuation during the presentation. Looks like a couple of people at Polytechnique had to leave the building. Alyssa is back online. So I guess you're good. All right, Alyssa gives it. So it looks like everything is clear. And Stuart is already here, so he's our next speaker. And I think this is a good chance to just have a discussion before Stuart presents. And I would like to open it up to the audience. I see that Ellie raised a hand. I also have some questions on Slido that I'm happy to ask, but if somebody wants to ask them themselves, that's even better. So let's see how it goes. We'll start with Ellie, and then I'll moderate a couple of questions.
I had a question about the alternative you proposed, because you talked about the BA of the peer review, but did someone already studied the BA of the other approach or not?
Have people tried those other approaches?
You said that locally they tried them. So did someone try to understand which BAs they can be, or if they are better? Because I think there are probably no perfect approach. So does someone has done like, because you said that they have been applied locally, so on those local applications, does someone actually try to see if that's actually more or less biased than the peer review?
And I think with the yeah, go ahead. I think it's bias, right? So Ellie, you're talking about bias.
Yeah, bias.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excuse
me. No problem. I think Stuart's going to talk about basically how we need to do more of that kind of experimentation, because we don't really have many head-to-head comparisons. Like there have been a lot of times people do things where they say they're going to experiment with science funding, and they're like, we're going to try something new, but they don't actually run an experiment where it's like they have a control condition and a randomized condition. They just do the different thing, and they kind of are using experiment in that more colloquial sense of like trying different things. So New Zealand, for example, did a lottery program where they allocated grants using a lottery, and they didn't like have they didn't have like peer review and a lottery, and then randomly allocate which one you ended up in, or say like we're going to randomly pick some disciplines and grant making programs, some will be by lottery, some will not be, and see how people responded. They just sort of did a lottery, and then they did a survey afterwards to say like how well do you think it went, and they actually found like people who won the lottery really liked it, and people who lost the lottery really didn't like it. So that was the result of the survey. At least that's my understanding. Like, this is secondhand for me. The other thing you can do, though, that's really interesting with lotteries is, like, in theory, you don't actually need to run an experiment. Like, you could just retroactively look at, these were the applications. If we had just used the peer review reports to say, like, nothing that gets below a 50% is going to be funded. Nothing, we're going to fund everything that's in the 10th percentile, but between 10 and 50, we're going to randomize. You could just literally see how would things have been different. Like, would we have funded systematically different kinds of proposals from different groups, different sized institutions, different demographics, different topics of research, and so on. Anyway, there are people who are hoping to work on that kind of thing, so maybe we'll know more in the future.
Thank you very much. So Jane has a question, and then I'll read some from Slido. Jane, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so if you go back to the beginning where you said that like most of the research is funded by the public sector instead of the private sector, do you think that's good or bad? Or do you think that could have like bias implications or?
I think that I think it's necessary, basically. Like, I think that the reasons that the private sector doesn't, like, there are famous private sector science organizations. Bell Labs is very famous, and like some of the AI research is now being done by private sector labs. And so when that works, often it has proven to be like it resulted in like technological breakthroughs. Like large companies that fund science, when they view it profitable to do so, have like a couple advantages. They have lots of money usually. They have an incentive to sort of integrate different disciplines, whereas like an individual, like an academic, is going to like focus on getting they're going to do research at the level of like a publishable paper output, whereas like a company might be like, we need to get a technology that works even if we have to pull in lots of different disciplines. So a famous example is like when Google invented Google Translate. I'm sure other people worked in it too, but they had to draw in like linguistics, they had to bring in statistics people, and they had to bring in computer science people. And like in academia, those three tracks might have been working on it separately and like publishing papers that were not that tied to each other, but they kind of integrated everything. But because of the long lags, to get an application, because of the uncertain applicability of a new discovery, and because others can steal your ideas, basically, I think you don't tend to see the private sector do it much. And I think we can't really expect that to change. Instead, we have to figure out how to make the public sector work as well as we can.
Okay, thank you. But one more question. Can't they just like do research and then not publish the stuff before they produce the service or product? That way people can't steal their stuff.
That's true. That mitigates the last idea. But often, even just creating the technology kind of discloses the principle on which it is based. And there's a whole literature about like, there are some kinds of fields where to do the thing reveals the thing. And there are other fields where there's a lot of, it's much more difficult to reverse engineer the principles behind which a technology works. And so you probably would find, like even in these AI labs right now, like they're very careful about keeping like the model weights secret, and they can publish the algorithms they can maybe publish the algorithms because only Google has the data that can run on the algorithms, or I don't know. That was true for a time. I don't know if that's really true anymore, but that's kind of how companies have thought about that before, and it works in some cases. And those might be some of the, why there's like 1/3 of the time we do see private sector involved. But there are other cases where I can't think of a great example right now, but like, I guess one is like reusable rockets, SpaceX doing them. Like you see it land, you're like, all right, that works. We know in principle that is a solvable problem now. They solved it. It's worth me doing R&D to figure out how to solve it too, because I know that I can look at what they did, and it will still be a lot of work, but there's something even to just knowing it can be done, that it's not a dead end if you go down that road.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank
so
you.
I'll try to
We have
condense.
one.
Yeah, I
There
noticed
was
that
one.
raised a
Okay,
hand.
sorry.
Yeah, but I just want
Yeah.
to condense a couple of questions on Slido that kind of play up the same angle. So basically, these are the questions that were asked by Anik, by Nika, by Erwan. Basically, all of these alternatives come with some blind spots. And of course, we know that. But to me, the most striking slide, and I think that's what people are kind of playing off of here, is when you say, well, if people know you, they're likely to fund your grant. And if they don't know you, there's not much you can do to basically get your grant funded. And in the end, it makes it feel like all these grants are just kind of like a screen behind which the shadow game happens. If people know you, then all of these models will work. People, not projects. Yes, if they know you. But what about junior researchers? Golden tickets. Yes, if people know you. So I think it really kind of hints in that direction, and we'd all like to hear your opinion on that.
No, I think that's great, and I think that there's this fundamental challenge, which is that science tends to take a long time to develop technologies, but also takes a long time to new ideas especially take a long time to realize, like, to sort of see their merit. It's hard to, so that makes it hard to basically be able to demonstrate to people that your idea works, right? Like it takes a long time for like if you have a new approach, it might be brilliant, but it might take a while for you to iron it out and then get the result. And even when you get the result, it might take a while for other people to believe it. There's this other problem in science, evaluating the quality of research and quality of science tends to take its own expertise. Like a layman can't really assess if this is good. And so you could do brilliant work, but if there's not other people who are in a field close enough to what you're working on to be able to assess and like raise the alarm, like this stuff is brilliant, look, this gets it, like that can be a problem. And so science has these sort of clubby and network effect problems where there's this it's hard to go out on your own. You kind of have to have a group with you to sort of validate your work. So yeah, there's a problem of how do you establish work when you don't have that track record. I think the few things that you can do are, like, lotteries are one potential approach, and that's maybe an argument to do lotteries is just like we know that there's this clubbiness sort of bias, and we want to avoid that. Another is you can just have literally like early career research grants that are like, we know that there's a problem where we need to provide a path for people to break in, and we know that's valuable. And so we just have some grants that are just only available to early career researchers. And that still has the problem of like if you're connected or not connected, but it maybe mitigates it a little bit. Yeah, those are the two things that come to mind for the moment anyway. But it's a real challenge. Yeah.
Alyssa, you raised a hand.
Yeah, so basically I missed a little bit towards the end, but I wanted to just like understand like the fact that the business takes 1/3 of like basic research and R&D and everything. Do you want them to take up more space or less space? And like, are we not worried for like, like a conflict of interest and everything? I'm not sure if that plays into something.
Yeah, so to clarify, science spends about 1/3 of the, sorry, I said science. Business spends about 1/3 of the sort of science funding. When you look at the non-science R&D side, so like the more engineering development of technologies, then they're like 80% or something. So they're huge. Is it good or bad? I think that it's difficult to know because like it's difficult to like rigorously know, right? Like in we don't have worlds where we can compare what happened when it was one way to what happened when it was another way. I think there are I'm an economist, and like I can tell you there's like a lot of a lot of arguments both ways, right? So like on the pro side, like we want more business in doing the R&D side. We have things like it's very risky to do business, and when R&D is funded by the private sector rather than the public sector, then they're the ones that are on the hook if it doesn't work out, right? So like people are putting their money where their mouth is in some sense, and like if they have a crazy idea, well, they don't have to convince us, they can just do it. And that's one argument. On the other hand, there's like market powers issues. There's a whole debate, and I'm actually writing a series on New Things on the Sun about the differences between the kinds of innovation conducted by large firms and small firms. And so it's a kind of a stylized fact that large firms tend to do, on average, like less innovative, less disruptive technologies than sort of small ones. That's a little different than like the question you're asking about basic versus applied, and if it should be public sector or not. But I guess it just speaks to sort of, people have thought a lot about the different problems of like having company sponsored R&D versus having it be in the public sector. I think the big critique against the public sector is that often it lacks the expertise and incentives to basically take things the last mile or to improve its systems. Like, I think it's notable that most sectors of the economy get more productive over time. Like they produce cars for cheaper, or they produce more phones for less labor. The phones get better, something, most things are like that. Agricultural yields go up year after year for the same hectare of land. It's not clear that that happens in science, like that scientists get better at writing papers and that the number of papers per scientist goes up. I think that it's possible that the reason that's the case is because, we don't have the same kinds of ruthless market competition forcing people to adapt better systems or go out of business. I don't think we should try to make science like business, because for all the three reasons I gave at the beginning, I think it just won't work. But I think that's maybe an argument for why the public sector has, is a downside of having to rely on the public sector to fund scientific research. But probably, I think, an unavoidable one. It's a little rambly.
Thank you, Matt. So while I have quite a few people here, Ellie, maybe a quick question, because I wanted to slowly move on to Stuart.
Okay, just a quick, because there's one point I'm not exactly sure. When you talk about public research, are you talking about like state-funded lab, or like schools or university, or what exactly are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm being a little hazy on purpose. I basically mean like not private sector, so not facing the strong profit incentive, basically. And so, we have a mix of federal, state, or I guess like not necessarily federal, public sector funding, or sorry, government funding of its own labs, government funding of research in universities, nonprofits, philanthropies, higher education using its own funds to support research, all that stuff. That the sort of unifying signal to this economist brain is like not following profit signals specifically.
Thank you. So I'd like one question while we're still on the call, especially because I'm not sure if you're going to stick around for Stuart, so I'm going to ask it now. Other people should feel free to pitch in. You made a very convincing argument that it takes a long time for the innovation to really kind of make an impact. Does that also contribute to this idea that science is slowing down? Basically, is that lag getting longer and longer? And there's different ways to ask that question, like, are ideas getting harder to find? So what is your impression after doing these analyses?
Yeah, there's two ways that I guess so one striking stylized fact is like, I've looked at the share of, when patents cite scientific literature, what is the share of their citations that go to research literature, to recent scientific research versus older scientific research, where here recent is within the last 5 years. And the share of those citations that go to papers published in the last 5 years has been falling pretty steadily for a long time. It's down from like 50% of citations to like 20%. And it's unclear what that means. That could be because new ideas are not as impactful as old ideas. Discovering DNA, people are maybe going to keep citing related work, but like discovering some variant of DNA is not as valuable. It could be
There's the
that,
Lindsay effect, right?
yeah, but there's a little bit of a counterbalance too, which is that people probably actually would not cite DNA papers anymore. Like they wouldn't cite Watson and Crick if they're referencing DNA anymore. It's just become an established fact, even though it's like the idea is influential. When papers are old and really famous, people actually can kind of stop citing them because you just don't need to anymore. So anyway, it could be that the idea is that there's an ideas problem. It's an idea supply problem, but it could also be kind of like you alluded to. I think maybe like a diffusion and sort of take up problem where like it's taking longer for people to apply the ideas for perhaps different reasons. In the space of biomedical innovation, maybe clinical trials are becoming like increasingly arduous to conduct, and it's becoming harder to find. Like there's a very realistic example of like in a clinical trial, if you want to improve on some drug, like a new vaccine, and you have an old and there's no vaccine, well then it's easy to find a population that's infected to compare them to when they get the vaccine to when they don't. That happened with COVID-19. But when you already have a vaccine, if you want to improve it, it takes longer to get the data you need because people have the vaccine, they don't get the disease as much, and so like you can't compare your new vaccine to the old one. Anyway, like that's a potential issue too. And I do think that, I mean, my bias is basically to think that on average, scientific problems get harder and harder to solve, and it takes more and more effort. We do supply more and more effort, but this kind of helps account for those facts. I've written a lot more about this, so I could go on for like another 2 hours about it, but I'll leave it there for now.
Mona raised a hand. Please go ahead.
Hello. Actually, I have a question. How about the collaboration between the academia and the private company? I mean, it could help to increase the scientific, because the academia people think more scientifically, but in the companies, they think more business. But if they collaborate together, I think they can improve the results, and they can help the grow the science.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And like I think that historically there has been like a really good there have been cases where scientists who are kind of working on both sides, like doing the fundamental science and then also collaborating with firms or engineers to try to commercialize it, has been like a really fruitful way to learn about where the science doesn't work and where there are questions that haven't been solved. So like in the this is called sort of the Pasteur's quadrant style of research, where it's like fundamental research but also like directed at solving a problem. And some people think that that's kind of like the most productive kind of research. I think like encouraging more is like a thing that some kinds of grant programs try to do. So like there's like a large EU program that looks at trying to encourage collaborations between business and science and like university labs. And so people have tried to sort of study the effects of those programs. The one study that I'm aware of, it didn't seem like there was that big of a change to sort of the science that was conducted when they had to work with business versus when they got a regular grant, but there were some other kind of subtle effects. I guess one other thing to note is that the movement between industry and academia has like declined over time. And sort of there was a heyday in the 1950s with these large corporate science labs like Bell Labs and Xerox PARC and stuff, where there was more movement between those two fields. People would publish lots of academic papers in business, then they go back to academia, and then there's crosswalk, and a lot of PhDs went into business and so forth. And sort of at least in the US, this is more US specific, as the US academic ecosystem has become stronger and stronger, there doesn't seem to be as much of that movement between anymore. Like the firms maybe just contract with researchers rather than hiring them for a while. At least that's a story some people tell.
Thank you very much. So I think we should use this opportunity to thank Matt. We really appreciate the time you took. And that was a very, very informative lecture. Matt, feel free to stick around, but I know you have other tasks, so if you need to leave, that's also fine.
Yeah.
Next, yeah, go ahead.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I probably will not be able to stick around for much longer, but I'll stick around for a few minutes.
Excellent, thank you.